Imagine two men who are, for all intents and purposes, the same person. Identical twins. Same DNA, same face, same height. The same genetic blueprint written into every cell of their bodies. They were even the same profession, both astronauts. Now imagine you take one of them and send him to live in space for almost an entire year, while his brother stays behind on Earth, living a normal life. And when the traveler finally comes home and the two brothers stand side by side again, they are no longer identical. Something in the one who left has changed. His very genes are behaving differently. His body has been quietly rewritten by space itself. This actually happened. It's one of the most extraordinary experiments NASA has ever run, and what it revealed about what space does to the human body is far stranger and in places far more unsettling than anyone expected. Today we're going to walk through exactly what changed in that astronaut's body, and stay with me to the end because the single most bizarre discovery of all only makes sense once you understand everything that came before it. Let's go. To understand why this experiment is so special, you have to understand the problem scientists have always faced. We've sent humans into space for decades, and we know it does strange things to the body. But there's always been a frustrating gap in the science. When an astronaut comes back changed, how do you know what's really down to space and what's just down to that particular person, their genes, their age, their lifestyle? Every human is different. To truly isolate the effect of space, you'd need an impossible thing, a perfect copy of the astronaut, kept safely on Earth, living through the same span of time so you could compare them at the end. A living, breathing control subject, genetically identical to the person you launched. And that is exactly what NASA got, because of a remarkable coincidence. Two of their astronauts, Scott and Mark Kelly, happened to be identical twins. Think about how rare that is. Two people with the same DNA, both trained astronauts. It was a once-in-history opportunity. So NASA built a landmark experiment around them. Scott Kelly would launch to the International Space Station and stay there for nearly a year, about 340 days, far longer than the usual 6-month stint. Meanwhile, his brother Mark would remain on the ground, going about his life, serving as the genetic control. Two identical men, same starting point, split between two worlds for almost a year. And then scientists would compare them down to the molecule. This became known as the NASA Twins Study, and the scale of it was staggering. 10 separate teams of scientists from across the country coordinated to study these two men. They collected blood, saliva, urine. They ran tests on the brothers before the mission, all the way through it, and for months after Scott returned. 25 months of monitoring in total. They examined everything: gene activity, the immune system, the gut, the eyes, the heart and arteries, cognitive performance, even the bacteria living inside the twins' bodies. It was the most detailed portrait ever assembled of what happens to a human being over a long stay in space. And the results began to roll in, layer by layer, each one stranger than the last. Let's start with the body you can see and feel, the obvious physical changes. One of the first things that happened to Scott in orbit was that he lost body mass. This is common for astronauts. In weightlessness, with food and exercise routines disrupted and the body no longer fighting gravity, the body composition shifts, but that was just the surface. The really interesting changes were happening deeper, in his arteries, his eyes, and eventually down at the level of his DNA itself. Before we go deep, though, there's the silent toll on the skeleton and muscles that every long-duration astronaut fights. In weightlessness, your bones and muscles suddenly have almost nothing to do. On Earth, simply standing and walking forces your legs, your spine, your whole frame to constantly work against gravity, and that load is what keeps them strong. Remove it, and the body, ever efficient, begins to dismantle what it no longer seems to need. Bones leak away their mineral density, growing weaker and more brittle. Muscles, especially the big ones in the legs and back, start to waste and shrink. This is why the space station is crammed with exercise equipment, and why astronauts like Scott have to strap themselves in and work out for around 2 hours every single day, not to stay in shape for vanity, but to fight a constant grinding battle against their own bodies trying to fall apart. Even with all that effort, astronauts routinely come home weaker, with thinner bones, needing time to rebuild what space stripped away. Scott was, in effect, doing daily combat just to slow the damage. Take the cardiovascular system. Researchers found that the main artery in Scott's neck, the carotid artery, actually changed during the mission. Its walls thickened and it became distended, wider than before. Now on Earth, that kind of arterial thickening is something we associate with aging and with raised risk of heart problems. To see it appear in a healthy, fit astronaut over the course of a single year in space was a genuine flag, a sign that microgravity puts the heart and blood vessels under a kind of stress we're only beginning to understand. The body, freed from gravity, has to completely rethink how it moves blood around, and the plumbing adapts in ways that aren't entirely healthy. Then there were his eyes. And this is one of the most well-documented problems in long-duration spaceflight. Scott's vision and the very structure of his eyes changed. The back of the eyeball and the tissues around the optic nerve were physically altered. The reason ties back to gravity again. On Earth, gravity pulls the fluids in your body downward, toward your feet. In space, with no such pull, those fluids drift upward and pool in the head. That rising pressure pushes on the back of the eyes, subtly reshaping them and affecting vision. Many astronauts come home needing glasses they didn't need before. Their eyes have been, quite literally, squeezed into a new shape by the fluids in their own skulls. So far, these are dramatic changes, but they're changes to the body's hardware, its tissues and organs. What makes the twins study so haunting is that the deepest changes weren't in Scott's organs at all. They were in his genes. And to explain what happened there, I have to introduce you to one of the strangest discoveries in the entire study, something involving the very tips of his chromosomes. But to understand why it shocked scientists, you first need to understand what these tiny structures normally do. So hold that image of the astronaut with the reshaped eyes, because we're about to go all the way down to the molecular level, and that's where this story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Deep inside almost every cell in your body sits your DNA, coiled into structures called chromosomes. And on the very ends of each chromosome are little protective caps called telomeres. The easiest way to picture them is like the little plastic tips on the ends of your shoelaces, the bits that stop the lace from fraying. Telomeres do the same job for your DNA. They stop the genetic material from unraveling and protect it every time a cell divides. But here's the crucial part. Every time a cell divides, those telomeres get a tiny bit shorter. Over a lifetime, as your cells divide again and again, your telomeres steadily wear down. This shortening is one of the fundamental clocks of aging. Short telomeres are associated with getting older, with age-related disease, with the body wearing out. As a rule, in life, telomeres only go one direction, down. So scientists studying the twins study expected that the stress of space, the radiation, the microgravity, the sheer hardship of it, that would make Scott's telomeres shorten faster than his brother's on Earth. They expected space to age him. Instead, they found the exact opposite, and it stunned them. During his time in orbit, Scott's telomeres got longer. The protective caps on his DNA, the very markers of youth, grew during his year in space, while his twin brother Mark's down on Earth stayed stable. For a brief, astonishing moment, it almost looked as though, by one measure, space was making Scott biologically younger than his identical twin. Now, before anyone books a ticket to the fountain of youth in orbit, here comes the twist, the part that turns this from a miracle into a warning. The lengthening was almost certainly not some magical anti-aging effect. Scientists think it was the body's response to extreme stress and the unusual conditions of spaceflight, possibly involving younger stem cells being flushed into the bloodstream. And critically, it did not last. The moment Scott returned to Earth, his telomeres came crashing back down, and not gradually. Within just 2 days of landing, most of that extra length was gone. They snapped back so fast it was alarming, and then it got worse. Over the following months, Scott ended up with more short telomeres than he'd had before he ever left. That matters because an unusually high number of short telomeres is linked to a raised risk of age-related conditions, including heart disease and some cancers down the line. So the great "space makes you younger" headline was, on closer inspection, the opposite of reassuring. Space had thrown one of the body's most fundamental aging clocks into chaos, and telomeres were just the beginning of the genetic strangeness, because the biggest story of the entire twin study was about gene expression. Now, this is a subtle but vital idea, so let's be clear about it. Space did not change Scott's actual DNA. He and Mark are still identical twins. The genetic code itself stayed the same. What changed was gene expression. Which genes were switched on and off, and how loudly. Think of your DNA as a giant piano. Spaceflight didn't rewrite the notes on the page, but it changed which keys were being pressed and how hard. Your body constantly adjusts gene expression in response to your environment, stress, diet, illness, all do it. But what happened to Scott was dramatic. Thousands of his genes changed their activity levels in space. And as the mission went on, especially in the second half, the changes intensified. At one point, there were around 6 times as many genetic changes as earlier in the flight, as if his body were working harder and harder to cope the longer he stayed up there. Now here's the reassuring part, and it's genuinely good news for the future of space travel. When Scott came back to Earth, the vast majority of those gene expression changes, around 93% of them, returned to normal within a matter of months. His body, by and large, knew how to recover. It readjusted, reset, came back toward baseline. For a year in the harshest environment humans have ever endured, that's a remarkably resilient result. But, and this is the detail that lingers, the one scientists keep circling back to, not everything reverted. A small fraction, around 7% of those gene expression changes, had still not returned to normal even 6 months after Scott was back on Earth. 7% that stayed changed. And it's what those particular genes are involved in that gives you pause. They're linked to things like the immune system, DNA repair, bone formation, and how the body handles low oxygen and high carbon dioxide. In other words, the genes that didn't bounce back are tied to some of the most fundamental systems for keeping a human alive and healthy. For some people, this got nicknamed the space gene effect, though it's not really a single gene. It's a lingering signature, a faint fingerprint that space pressed into Scott's biology and that hadn't faded months later. There was an even subtler layer beneath this too, one scientists call epigenetics. If gene expression is about which keys on the piano get pressed, epigenetics is about the little chemical sticky notes attached to the DNA that tell those keys when to play. One of the main ones is a process called methylation, a kind of molecular tagging that switches genes up or down. And the study found that Scott's pattern of these chemical tags shifted in space, particularly on genes tied to the immune system and to handling stress, before largely settling back once he was home. Why does this matter so much? Because epigenetic marks are how the environment leaves a lasting imprint on your biology without ever touching the underlying code. They're the mechanism by which an experience, like a year in orbit, can keep echoing through your cells long after the event itself is over. It was more evidence that space doesn't just press on the body from the outside, it reaches in and rewires how the genetic machinery runs. And there's a darker thread running alongside all of this: damage. Out in space, beyond much of Earth's protective shielding, the body is bombarded by radiation, and the study found signs of it written into Scott's chromosomes. Increased genetic damage, including chromosomal inversions, where pieces of DNA get broken and flipped around. Some of this DNA damage was still detectable after he returned. This is one of the great looming dangers of deep space travel: radiation quietly scrambling the genetic code, with consequences that may only show up years later. The strangeness reached even into places you might never think of, like the trillions of bacteria living in Scott's gut. We now know that the microscopic ecosystem in our intestines is deeply tied to our health, our immunity, even our mood. And during the mission, the balance of Scott's gut bacteria shifted, changing in ways his brothers didn't. Reassuringly, this one largely returned to normal once he was back on Earth and eating a normal diet again. But it's another reminder that space doesn't just change the big, obvious things. It reaches into every corner of the body, even the living colonies of microbes we carry inside us. Then there's the brain. For most of the mission, Scott's cognitive performance held up impressively well. His speed and accuracy on mental tasks stayed strong throughout the long flight, which is encouraging news for the idea of long missions. But the trouble came afterward. After he landed, scientists noticed a measurable drop in his cognitive speed and accuracy, and this decline lingered for months. It seems the brutal transition of coming back to gravity, the physical shock of re-entry and readjustment, took a real toll on his mind. Going to space is hard, but in some ways, the data suggests, coming back and forcing the body to readapt to Earth might be just as punishing. In fact, the homecoming was physically brutal in ways that go beyond the brain. After nearly a year without gravity, Scott's body had forgotten how to be on Earth. When he first returned, simply standing up was a struggle. His legs swelled, he felt heavy and sore. His skin, which had barely touched anything for a year, became painfully sensitive where it pressed against chairs and floors. He has spoken about feeling almost flu-like, exhausted and aching, as his body relearned the simple act of carrying its own weight. There was even a curious detail. Scott came back temporarily taller by around 5 centimeters, because without gravity compressing it, his spine had stretched out in orbit, only to be squeezed back down within days of his return. It's a vivid reminder that our bodies are exquisitely tuned to this planet, and that pulling one out of that environment and dropping it back in is a violent process in both directions. Now, amid all these unsettling findings, there was at least one piece of genuinely heartening news, and it's important. Scott's immune system kept working properly in space. In fact, in a first for spaceflight, he was given a flu vaccine while in orbit, and his body responded to it exactly the way it would have on Earth, mounting a proper immune defense. That's a big deal. It tells us that should astronauts on a long mission to Mars ever need medical treatment or vaccination, their immune systems can still rise to the occasion far from home. So let's step back and assemble the whole picture, because this is where the real meaning lives. After 340 days in space, Scott Kelly's body had been changed in thousands of ways. His mass, his arteries, his eyes, his gut, his chromosomes, his very gene activity. For a time, he and his identical twin were no longer biologically identical at all. And yet, the headline conclusion of the scientists was, on balance, hopeful. Human health can be mostly sustained over a year in space. The overwhelming majority of the changes reversed. The body proved astonishingly adaptable, bending under the strain of space and then springing back when it came home. There were, as one researcher put it, no showstoppers, nothing that screams it's impossible for humans to endure long journeys off-world. But that word, mostly, is doing an enormous amount of work. And this is the thought I want to leave you sitting with, because here's the unsettling context the cheerful headlines often leave out. Scott Kelly spent his year on the International Space Station, which orbits relatively close to Earth, still nestled within the protection of our planet's magnetic field, which deflects much of the most dangerous radiation. He was, in cosmic terms, still almost home. A journey to Mars would be a completely different beast. It would last far longer, years, not months, and for most of it, astronauts would be beyond that magnetic shield, fully exposed to the harsh radiation of deep space, with no quick way back. If a single year in the relative safety of low orbit left a 7% fingerprint on Scott's genes that hadn't faded after 6 months, and scrambled some of his chromosomes, and left him with more of those worrying short telomeres, what would years in the truly hostile deep do to a human body? We genuinely don't know yet. And that's the question this whole extraordinary experiment leaves hanging in the air. Scott Kelly came home, hugged his identical twin, and slowly, over months, became himself again. Almost. The faint signature space left in him is a preview, a first whisper of the price the human body may pay to truly leave this world behind. We've proven we can survive a year out there and come back. But the deeper question, whether our fragile, Earth-evolved bodies can endure the far longer, far more dangerous voyage to another planet, and whether we'd ever fully return to who we were, that answer is still out there, waiting in the dark for the first humans brave enough to go find it.